Wow, this is the most expensive PC I have ever seen.
Yeah, do you know how much I paid for it?
Oh, at least 3,000.
Nah mate, I paid a little over $1,000 for it.
Oh, that's as cheap as fried rice.
Over the last few years on YouTube, I've seen a lot of PCs that involve the title sleeper, in that they're a really ugly looking build and they've got some really good components inside. Though I've never built one personally because it just doesn't compare to the same feeling that you get when you drag race in a sleeper and you see that person in a ridiculously expensive car and the reaction on their face. I don't think you can get that with a sleeper PC. Though, back in the day there was also another element called the opposite of the sleeper, and that was the RICER. Though the funny thing about the RICER car was, even though at the lights you would be drag racing them and then taking off and you'd be 5 car lengths ahead in a matter of seconds and you'd be looking back and laughing, and you think to yourself, wow, this car's got it all. It's got the looks, it's got the sound, it's even got neon strips underneath. It's as if someone pulled this car out of Fast and Furious. But the problem was it just didn't have the goods under the hood to perform like it looked. Though there was always 2 respects that I gave to RICERs back in the day. And that was the first thing, they would always pick up, and they'd pick up pretty well. The second thing was that they had good resale on their cars. That was undeniable, and sometimes they would even make a profit. Though let's go through all the components here to see how you can get a PC that looks like it's worth a few $1,000s. It's got that i9 title, it's got that flagship AMD graphics card title on it, but it ends up coming in under $1,000. Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and this PC involves a few core components that are very important to make it this RICER build. And the first thing is the i9-9900t engineering sample. We can currently get these from AliExpress for $215 shipped. That's right, we've got an i9-9900, it's got the same amount of cache on board, it's also got 8 cores, 16 threads, and it's also coming in at under half the cost of a 9900K. Now the caveat here is that simply it doesn't clock as high. In fact, what I'm reading from reports here is that it's only going up to 3.2 or 3.3 gigahertz all cores. However, there are some really big augmented benefits besides the cost savings versus the 9900K. And the first thing is, we can use an H310 motherboard. These can be had for as little as $60. In Australia, I picked this one up. This is the H310 VDH Pro Plus from MSI. We got this for 89 Aussie dollars. Now out of the box, this worked absolutely fine with this CPU. I didn't even have to update the BIOS. But of course, if you do get an H310 motherboard, you may have to update the BIOS, and I don't know how many motherboards this CPU will work with. I just got lucky in this combination in that it worked flawlessly as soon as I turned it on. The next component is we can now save on the power supply. Since our CPU, I think, will juice a lot less power, we can now get away with a more budget-orientated power supply. I managed to pick up a high-tech 750 watt, which I've used in the past and they're pretty decent. I got this for 20 Aussie dollars off the used market. The next component is the cooler. Since we're going to be putting out a lot less heat, we're now getting away with a 25 Aussie dollar cooler, or 17 USD for those folks in the USA. This makes our motherboard, power supply, and cooler combo literally come in under that of what you would get with a single cooler on your 9900K. So we're absolutely winning already. Now for the graphics card in this build, we're using the MSI Gaming X5700. However, in a previous video, and I'll put the link up here, I flashed this to a 5700 XT and got more performance out of it. So now we've got a flagship MSI AMD graphics card that not only looks the part, but also really quietens down on noise and just has an amazing aesthetic that it's going to bring to this build. This ended up costing me 543 Aussie dollars shipped, and I got it on an eBay sale, which would be about 367 USD. Though for storage here, we're going with a 256 gigabyte SSD for our main boot drive, and then a 1 terabyte for our games storage. And then the last component in this build, which is going to make it riced out of control. This is the BitFenix TG Dawn. This case has it all. It's got tempered glass on the side, the front and the back, and you've got diamond effects on the front and back with RGB glowing through that, which you can control the lighting effects from the front panel itself with the click of a button. So all these components in today's build tally up to $922 US, or if you're in Australia, 1,362 AUD. Now I will be adding 2 RGB strips, which should work off the included controller on the TG Dawn. So we won't have to buy any extra controllers and it'll all work off that single button. These will cost around an extra $15 or in Australia, 20 AUD. So with that total cost out of the way, will this build end up being a complete blunder in that the temperatures don't work, the parts just don't work together? Or will the tech yes intuition here birth an entirely new meta? Let's build this thing and then find out. And now we've finished this build here, the ultimate RICER, and it is spiced up. It's got RGB all over the place. We've got a vertically mounted GPU, even got a Core 2 Duo supporting that graphics card. So that's right, Core 2 Duos can still support something in 2020. But right now, what we've got to do is tune this thing up because the 9900T, I've never used this before. I don't know what it's capable of. I've got to check it out, try and tune the memory as best as I can, and also try and overclock the GPU as far as that can go, because I really want to get the most out of this whole build. And besides that, I want to test the airflow on this case because so far it does look really good, especially once we've added in some glow at the front here. So we actually ended up putting a longer strip in here to light up the whole front of the build so we could actually see the graphics card, because that's got only a little RGB light on top there. But on the front here, it's got this whole unique pattern that shines through the glass. And I gotta say, I thought it may have been tacky at first, but after looking at it, it's really well built. Like BitFenix have made sure that they've got this little glow going around the whole edge of the tempered glass, kind of like a semi-modular power supply, but in this case, it's like a semi-tron RGB lighting. And you've got the button up there with ease to change the color scheme and even turn it off if you don't like RGB. So I'm really liking this PC and what it's about so far. But anyway, let's see what we can come up with, temperatures and tuning and all that stuff, and then we'll get on to the FPS and the gaming. So we just finished the tuning and all the testing, and there's nothing but good news. And the first thing, we're gonna start with the H310 motherboard. These are designed for, I believe, 65 watt TDP max in mind. And here's where the really good news comes out, and that is that this 9900T only juices around 50 watts on max load, and that's going 3.2 gigahertz on all cores. Now I can't clock this any higher manually. There's actually no B clock overclock on this motherboard too, so that's the maximum speeds that we're left with. Though the single core speeds did go up to around 3.6, 3.7 gigahertz. The Cinebench scores showed that we got all cores in R20 of 3,347 points, and then the single score was over 360 points. So what we had here was a really good synergy between budget RGB memory, a budget cooler, and also a budget motherboard. Testing out the VRM temperatures on this motherboard during a stress test in 28 degrees C ambient environments saw the maximum temperature of 63 degrees. So the motherboard's absolutely clear for this CPU. The cooler, that was pretty, that wasn't even getting warm to touch really. So it was doing a fine job, but the CPU was running a bit hot. So with the tempered glass side panel on versus off, we saw 99 degrees max versus 94. Though the TJ junction, the max temperature is 110 degrees. So we still have a bit of headroom here. It's just, it might need a delit or something like that. Since it is an engineering sample, I'm guessing that delitting it would drop the temperatures quite a bit. But then again, they might be using the stim on the engineering samples. But for what it's worth, this is a stress test. This is pretty much the worst case scenario. In games, it's really only going to go to around 70 degrees max, I feel. So we should be okay. We shouldn't have to really do anything to the CPU and its temperatures. Though, testing out the GPU now, pretty much with this 5700 XT flash, overclocking it even just by a little bit didn't really net us any gains worth mentioning. In fact, when I ran the Unigine Heaven benchmark, both times non-overclocked and overclocked, we saw 3,681 points versus 3,653 points. So we only gained like 30 points, and the minimum was actually worse with the overclocks in, meaning this card's pretty much pushed to the brink after this VBIOS update and the flash from the 57 to the 5700 XT. Though, what about the GPU temperatures, which is one of the most important tests when we're testing, especially in the case of the Dawn TG. And with the tempered glass side panel on versus off, we saw 69 degrees versus 73, and then on the memory, 82 versus 86. The VRM temperature for some reason wasn't reading out. That's most likely because of the flash that we did. But then again, we're only losing 4 degrees on the GPU, and it's still in the 70s. So it's absolutely fine. Of course, ideal temperatures would be to be dropping if we put that side glass panel on. But in this case, we're making up a lot for those temperature drops with the bling that this case has to offer. Though the ideal scenario with any case tests I do around here is actually when you put the panel on, you get lowered temperatures on either the CPU or the GPU. The fact that the temperatures are going a little bit higher can definitely be attributed to that front glass panel, which although it makes up for in aesthetics, it does become a detriment to temperatures. Though the good thing is this whole build is really quiet even while we're stress testing it. So I'm happy with that, and I'll let you guys listen and see if you can hear much noise. Okay, time for gaming. So the first game we finished up testing on the RICER PC is For Honor, and at 1080p and 1440p, we got 153 average FPS and 103 average FPS respectively. The minimum FPS was showing exactly what the graph was showing the whole time, and that was ridiculously smooth FPS, as well as that GPU utilization was practically near 100%. Let's move on now to the next title, which is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And completing Shadow of the Tomb Raider has painted an interesting picture. First of all, the CPU utilization and the wattage it's using during these benchmarks. It's only using 20 watts, and it's going somewhere between 3.2 and 3.3 gigahertz all cores. So it looks like in games, you can extract an extra 100 megahertz out of this CPU. Though 1080p, we got 86 average FPS, 1440p, we got 64 average FPS. 1440p was saying GPU bound 99%, though it is saying GPU bound 61% at 1080p. So when I do this comparison with this CPU versus, say, Ryzen 5 3600 and a 9900K, I will be interested to see this 1080p result with this flashed 5700 XT to see if we're losing much performance versus those other two gaming scenarios. And now we've got F1 2019 with maximum settings, TAA, and also heavy rain on the benchmark, which does place more of a strain than a clear day. What we saw here at 1080p, we got 77 average FPS, 61%, and then 0.1% low of 37. And then on 1440p, we saw 66 average FPS, 53 1%, and 38.1% low. So the FPS does seem a little bit smooth on this title, though I am really curious to see how this will perform against those other two CPUs that I mentioned before. And to finish things off with the last title here, Fortnite, we had epic settings at 1080p and also 1440p, and we saw the results were pretty similar. So the CPU was being stressed at both these resolutions, and when I stopped it down to low settings with epic distance, we saw pretty much identical FPS at both 1440p and 1080p. So this graphics card is pushing this 9900T at both resolutions, so it would be a better combo suited for 1440p gaming because of that. Though, all in all, we did have a system that really balanced out everything from the noise to the temperatures and to the most important thing of all, and that is the FPS, where the 1% and 0.1% lows were really smooth. We still managed to get that DDR4 memory up to 2666 megahertz with tighter timings because it is 3000 megahertz XMP. Though with the limitations of that H310 motherboard and the memory speeds, the funny thing about that was the cost of this total build is coming a little over 900 USD or 1300 Australian dollars, which is pretty incredible considering we've got an i9 and a 5700 XT in this build. Though with that i9 and 5700 XT in this build boosting up the spec sheet, I can't help but think the ultimate rice piece of this build was that BitFenix Dawn TG case. It has the tempered glass all around, we added those RGB strips, it has that RGB fan at the back, as well as the onboard RGB controller, and then we've got RGB memory coupled with an RGB fan on top of our CPU cooler. Now the good thing about the top-down CPU cooler too was that draft of air going down on the VRM, which I believe did help cool down this budget motherboard. Although there was a little bit of detriment to the temperatures when we kept the side panel on versus off, it wasn't that bad in this particular build. Though I do caution, if you do go with like a 2080 Ti and something like a 9900K, which at least from my testing here would use up roughly 120 more watts on the CPU alone than it would with the 9900T. So it's basically over 3 times the power consumption for only 1.8 gigahertz extra speeds. So you see here that the diminishing returns on the 9900T versus the K is massive. And so that heat being dumped in the case would, if we had a much higher end spec build, increase the differences between the side panel on and off. So with the Dawn TG, it does look really nice, but do keep in mind I wouldn't be putting any sort of higher end parts in this thing than what we did with this build today. So say for instance, a mid-range CPU and a 5700 XT. I think it's a good balance, especially if you want to get the bling and extract the aesthetics out of this case. Though on top of that, it does have a lot more support, however, for things like radiators. So if you wanted to use a 240 or 280 mil rad, you can put that up the top as well as support at the front for a 360 or 280 mil rad too. And then there's the ability to mount up to 7 120 mil fans as well as 5 140 mil fans at the top and the front of this case. So lots of options that you can do with this thing, and the build quality was surprising, really straightforward, instruction manual checked out, as well as the top of the case had this like airflow dust filter thing that blocks everything off. I never used them. I'd kind of wish BitFenix didn't include that and dropped a little bit off the cost of this case and just kept the mesh on the top, as this thing currently comes in at 129 USD, so it's not too bad for the price considering the amount of bling and tempered glass it's bringing to the table. As far as Aussie pricing, I'm not too sure, but all in all, we ended up totaling a build here that came in at just such a good price point. But what's more important is I'm interested in hearing you guys and your feedback on the 9900T, that budget engineering sample off AliExpress, that when I checked from the particular seller on AliExpress, they've got over 9,900 of these things available which is a lot. So I don't see them selling out anytime soon. So the stock is definitely there. But when it comes, as I said before, with a different H310 motherboard, I'm not too sure. The one that I bought here from the store had that BIOS. I think it was like the 3rd revision automatically installed, and I didn't want to risk updating the BIOS again, because you only really update the BIOS if there's a problem. That's the general reason for updating a BIOS. If nothing's wrong, everything's running really smooth, then usually you don't need to update the BIOS. And that's exactly what happened here, because on the flip side of things, if I did update the BIOS on this H310 motherboard, I do then run the risk of maybe they're taking out the CPU microcode support for the engineering sample, which I have seen in the past, and that could cause our CPU not to work. So the fact that it all worked out of the box smooth, I was super happy with this CPU. Even though it says CPU 000, that means it's actually an early engineering sample in the process. I believe this CPU was made in 2018. Though that aside, I will be comparing it to the 9900K as well as the Ryzen 5 3600 in an upcoming video within the next week, so stay tuned for that. I'll probably compare it with the 5700 XT, as I think the $200 price point for a CPU is best coupled with the GPU around the $400 price range of the 5700 XT. So do let us know in the comments what you think about those upcoming tests as well. And with that aside, we've actually got 2 questions of the day, but they're pretty much similar questions that came in within a short time span of each other. And the question basically is, what music do you use at this point in time? This is awesome. And the other person says, I really want to know what this track is. And I get this a lot when I do upload my videos, and I do apologize for not putting all the names of the songs in, but it usually takes me a very long time. So I do list the places right down the bottom where I get them from. And this song was Moanin' Horizon from Royalty Free Planet. Now they upload a heap of good tracks that are mainly focused on that sort of retro modern vibe of synthwave, if you guys know that genre of music. I absolutely love it. And so they've got a lot of cool tracks that I put in my videos. And usually with music, I just download a heap of different free-to-play music, and then I go through and I select the best stuff. And I usually don't keep track of some of the names that I use, but I do keep track of the places that I get them from, and you can go check them out and then see all the different cool music that they've got available. But hopefully that answers that question. And with that aside, if you guys enjoyed this new Ultimate RICER PC, then be sure to hit that like button for us, and do let us know what you think of this build. This is sort of like a new experiment. We're going into a new sort of zone here with this build, but I thought it all worked out in the end, and it all worked out really well. And with that aside, if you guys are enjoying this content, you want to see it the moment it drops, and you're not yet subbed, then don't forget to hit that sub button on the way out, ring that bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.